He sits across from her at dinner, phone face down on the table. She's talking about her day, something about a co-worker who said something passive-aggressive. He nods at the right moments, makes the appropriate sounds, but inside, he checked out 3 months ago. He just hasn't told her yet. This isn't about some crisis or big fight. There's no screaming, no drama. He's just done. And the scary part, she has no idea. Something's happening right now that nobody wants to talk about. Men are walking away from relationships in record numbers, but they're doing it silently. No manifestos, no angry posts, no grand declarations. They're just quietly closing the door and leaving the room. And if you're wondering why, the answer is going to surprise you because it's not what the internet is telling you. Let me show you what's really going on. Here's what most people miss when they talk about this phenomenon. We're so busy arguing about dating apps and modern hookup culture that we're completely overlooking the psychological shift that's actually driving this behavior. Think about this for a second. When a man used to leave a relationship, there was usually a catalyst, an affair, a massive argument, irreconcilable differences that everyone could point to. But what we're seeing now is different. These men aren't leaving because something catastrophic happened. They're leaving because of accumulated weight. Picture a backpack. Every day, someone puts a small pebble in it. 1 pebble, you don't even notice. 10 pebbles, still fine. But somewhere around pebble 347, your knees start buckling, and you can't even explain why, because no single pebble was that heavy. That's what's happening here. I talked to a guy last month. Let's call him Marcus. 32 years old, good job, been with his girlfriend for 4 years. On paper, everything looked perfect. But when he finally opened up, he said something that stuck with me. I feel like I'm constantly auditioning for a role I already got cast in. Let that sink in. He wasn't talking about some unreasonable partner or toxic relationship. He was describing something more insidious. This feeling that no matter what he did, it was never quite enough to secure his position. Every day was another test he didn't know he was taking. But here's where it gets interesting. This isn't actually about the women in these relationships being deliberately cruel or manipulative. What we're witnessing is a collision between changing social expectations and unchanged emotional needs, and men are caught in the crossfire with no instruction manual. So what do you do when you're trying to understand this? You have to look at what modern relationships are actually demanding from men right now. Let me paint you a picture. A generation ago, the contract was relatively simple. A man provided financial stability and protection. A woman provided emotional labour and domestic management. Now, before you jump down my throat, I'm not saying that was fair or right or something we should return to. I'm just stating what the understood framework was. Here's the thing though. That contract got ripped up, and rightfully so. Women entered the workforce, fought for equality, and dismantled oppressive structures. Fantastic. Necessary. Long overdue. But something got lost in translation. The expectations on men didn't get renegotiated, they got multiplied. Think about what's being asked of men in relationships today. They're still expected to be providers, even when their partner makes similar or more money. They're expected to be emotionally available and vulnerable, but not too vulnerable because that reads as weakness. They need to be ambitious and driven, but also present and attentive. They should be confident leaders, but also respectful collaborators who defer to their partner's needs. See the problem? These aren't just high standards, they're contradictory standards. One guy I know, Daniel, described it like this. I'm supposed to read her mind about when she wants me to take charge and when she wants me to step back, and if I guess wrong either way, I'm either controlling or passive. There's no winning move, so I just stopped playing. Here's what's really fascinating about this. When psychologists study relationship satisfaction, they found something unexpected. The relationships that fail aren't usually the ones with the most conflict. They're the ones where one or both partners feel like they're performing rather than being. And men are tired of performing. Now you might be wondering, if these guys are so unhappy, why don't they just say something? Why the silent retreat instead of honest conversation? Great question. Let me show you how this actually works in the real world, A man tries to express dissatisfaction in a relationship. Maybe he's feeling underappreciated or overwhelmed by expectations. He's been taught that communication is key, right? So he speaks up. What happens next depends on how he frames it, but either way he's probably screwed. If he's too direct, he's being harsh or insensitive. If he's too soft, he's not really communicating and gets accused of hiding his feelings. If he uses "I feel" statements like he's supposed to, those feelings get debated as if they're opinions rather than experiences. I watched this play out with a friend recently. He told his partner he felt overwhelmed by the amount of emotional processing she needed from him after work when he was already drained. Reasonable concern, right? Her response: "So you're saying you don't care about my feelings?" That's not what he said, but that's what she heard. And now he's on defense, explaining himself, reassuring her, managing her emotions about his attempt to express his emotions. The conversation that was supposed to relieve pressure just created more. After a few rounds of this, he learned a lesson. Saying nothing is easier than saying something. Here's where this gets really dark, though. That silence isn't peace, it's resignation. And resignation is the relationship killer that nobody sees coming because it doesn't announce itself. When a man stops fighting, stops arguing, stops trying to fix things, everyone breathes a sigh of relief. Finally, he's being agreeable. He's going with the flow. The relationship seems calmer. But calm isn't the same as healthy. Sometimes calm is just the sound of someone giving up. But here's where it gets interesting, and this is the part that's going to make some people uncomfortable. We talk a lot about emotional labor in relationships, and we should. Women have carried an unfair burden of emotional management for centuries, but there's another form of labor that's completely invisible, and it's crushing men without anyone noticing. I call it expectation labor. The constant mental load of trying to figure out what's expected, meeting those expectations, and bracing for when you inevitably fall short. Let me give you a concrete example. A couple is planning their weekend. She says, "I don't care what we do, you pick." Seems simple, right? But here's what's actually happening in his head. If I pick something too simple, she'll think I'm not putting in effort. If I pick something too expensive, she'll think I'm showing off or being financially irresponsible. If I pick something I want to do, she might not enjoy it, and I'll feel guilty. If I ask what she wants to do, she'll be frustrated that I'm not taking initiative. 4 sentences of requests just turned into an impossible puzzle with no right answer. Now multiply that by every decision, every conversation, every interaction. What starts as individual moments becomes a constant state of hypervigilance. You're not relaxing with your partner anymore. You're managing a complex system where the rules change without notice. Think about this for a second. When researchers study chronic stress, they find that unpredictability is more damaging than consistent pressure. A rat that gets shocked randomly develops more severe stress responses than a rat that gets shocked on a predictable schedule. At least with predictability, you can prepare. Men in modern relationships often feel like they're getting randomly shocked, then criticized for flinching. So what do you do when physical intimacy becomes another minefield? This is the part nobody wants to address honestly, but we need to. Sexual dynamics in relationships have become so fraught with complexity that men are choosing absence over navigation. Here's what I mean. A healthy sex life requires vulnerability, spontaneity, and some degree of instinctual connection. But modern relationships have layered so much conscious processing onto physical intimacy that the spontaneity dies. A guy I know, let's call him Ryan, described it this way. Every time I initiate, I feel like I'm filling out a consent form in triplicate. And I know that sounds bad, like I'm complaining about basic respect. But there's a difference between enthusiastic consent and bureaucratic approval. One feels like connection, the other feels like I'm asking permission to exist. The fear of misreading signals, of being too aggressive or not assertive enough, of wanting sex more or less than she does, it creates a paralysis. And paralysis in intimacy is fatal. Let that sink in. But here's the really tragic part. Women aren't happy either. They're wondering why their partner never initiates anymore, why the passion has died, why everything feels so mechanical. And they don't realize that their partner has interpreted their need for explicit communication as evidence that his desire is unwelcome unless pre-approved. This creates a death spiral. Less intimacy leads to less connection. Less connection leads to more emotional distance. More emotional distance makes intimacy even harder. And before you know it, two people who genuinely care about each other are living like polite roommates. The man doesn't leave because he hates her. He leaves because he can't remember the last time he felt wanted instead of tolerated. Now let me show you something that's making all of this exponentially worse. Social media has turned relationships into performance art, and men are tired of auditioning. Every relationship now exists in comparison to everyone else's highlight reel. She sees her friend's boyfriend planning elaborate surprises and wonders why her partner doesn't do that. He sees other couples who seem effortlessly happy and wonders what he's doing wrong. But here's what most people miss. The comparison isn't just external anymore, it's historical. Women are comparing their current relationship to every romantic movie, every love song, every fictional ideal they've consumed since childhood. And men are being measured against a composite character who doesn't exist. The emotional availability of a therapist, the ambition of an entrepreneur, the physique of an athlete, the sensitivity of a poet, and the confidence of a leader. One conversation that stuck with me was with a guy named Trevor. He said, "I'm not competing with other men anymore. I'm competing with her imagination of what a perfect partner would be. And imagination always wins because it doesn't have to deal with reality." Think about how demoralizing that is. You're not failing because of what you are. You're failing because of what you aren't, measured against a standard that's literally impossible. And when men try to express this, they get labeled as insecure or fragile. But insecurity isn't the same as exhaustion from an unwinnable game. Here's where this gets really interesting from a practical standpoint. Men are doing a cost-benefit analysis on relationships, and increasingly the math isn't working out. But it's not the cost-benefit analysis you think. This isn't about gold diggers or materialistic women. This is about what economists call opportunity cost. What are you giving up by being in a relationship versus what you're gaining? Previous generations looked at this equation and saw clear benefits. Partnership meant a more stable life, shared expenses, emotional support, regular intimacy, and social legitimacy. The costs were clear too: freedom, autonomy, financial responsibility, but they seemed worth it. For modern men, that equation looks different. They're already expected to be emotionally self-sufficient because showing too much need is unattractive. They're not gaining financial advantage because most women work and many relationships split costs anyway. Social legitimacy. In a culture that celebrates independence and personal growth, being single isn't stigmatized anymore. So what's left? Companionship and intimacy. But if that companionship feels like constant evaluation, and that intimacy comes with layers of anxiety, what exactly is being gained? Let me be clear here. I'm not saying men are right to think this way, or that relationships don't have value. I'm explaining the internal calculus that's happening. A guy named Jason told me something that crystallized this. I was miserable in my relationship for 2 years. I've been single for 6 months, and I'm not happy, but I'm not exhausted anymore. And right now, that feels like an upgrade. That's the sentence that should terrify anyone interested in relationship health. We've reached a point where absence of misery is preferable to presence of partnership. So what do you do when the very tool that's supposed to fix problems becomes part of the problem? We've been told for decades that communication is the answer to relationship issues, and in theory that's true, but we've created a version of communication that's so processed and therapeutic that it's lost its humanity. Here's what I mean. Modern relationship communication often follows a formula. Identify your feelings, use I statements, avoid blame, validate your partner's experience, find compromise. All good advice in principle. But real human connection doesn't follow formulas. Sometimes you need to argue passionately, Sometimes you need to be blunt. Sometimes you need to be messy and imperfect and say the wrong thing in the right spirit. The therapeutic model of communication works great in therapy because there's a mediator and a clear goal. But in daily life, it creates an emotional distance because you're constantly translating your actual feelings into approved language. Think about this. When's the last time you had a really connecting moment with someone? Was it during a perfectly structured conversation where everyone used I statements? Or was it during an imperfect, messy exchange where you both just said what you actually meant? Men are walking away because they're tired of translating themselves into acceptable versions. They want to be known, not managed. Here's the thing that keeps me up at night. We're treating this phenomenon like it's a phase or a trend that will self-correct. It won't. Every year, more men are choosing to opt out. Not because they hate women or relationships, but because the cost of participation has exceeded their capacity to pay. And we're not addressing the root causes, we're just shaming the symptoms. When men express frustration with modern dating or relationships, they get called incels or told to go to therapy. When they choose to focus on themselves, they get accused of immaturity or fear of commitment. There's no acceptable way for a man to critique relationship dynamics without being dismissed. So they stop critiquing, they just leave. And here's what's fascinating. In 10 years, we're going to have a generation of men and women who both want partnership but have no idea how to build it, because the social contract is so broken that nobody knows what they're agreeing to anymore. The women will wonder where all the good men went. The men will wonder why wanting peace is considered settling for less. So what actually happens next? Look, I'm not here to tell you that men are victims or that women are the problem. This isn't about taking sides. This is about recognizing that we've created a system that's failing everyone. If you're a man feeling this exhaustion, here's what you need to understand. Walking away might give you relief, but it won't give you fulfillment. The answer isn't to avoid relationships. It's to find or build one where you can exist as yourself rather than as a performance. That means being selective. It means having uncomfortable conversations early. It means walking away from people who treat you like a fixer-upper project. And yes, it means being alone until you find something real rather than settling for something comfortable. If you're a woman wondering why men seem so distant or why relationships feel harder than they should, consider this. The man in front of you might not be emotionally unavailable. He might be emotionally depleted from previous experiences where vulnerability was weaponized. Creating safety doesn't mean lowering standards. It means making sure your standards are about compatibility, not compliance. And for everyone, we need to remember something crucial. Relationships aren't supposed to be this hard. Yes, they require work. Yes, they require compromise. But they're not supposed to feel like a second job where you're always on probation. The men who are walking away aren't quitting on love. They're quitting on a version of relationships that demands everything and offers conditional acceptance in return. Maybe that's not such a bad instinct after all. The question isn't why men are leaving. The question is, what kind of relationships are we building that make leaving feel like the healthiest option? And until we're ready to answer that honestly, this quiet exodus is going to continue. Because at the end of the day, you can't shame people into wanting what's hurting them.